Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Dear students, welcome back to our sessions with the subject Human Resource Management. In today's session, we will talk about a very important topic, that is employee testing and selection. Now, before we start, we need to talk about the objectives of our session. We have different sessions here, different objectives for the current session as follows. We will talk about reliability and validity of the test. We need to explain how you would go about validating a test. Another objective here is to cite and illustrate our testing guidelines, very important tips in a way to do the selection. List several tests you could use for employee selection, and of course how to use them. Explain the key points to remember in conducting background investigations. Now, these are the objectives, and accordingly we will have the following contents. The first is about the reliability and validity as important features of any given test. Then we will talk about test validation, the selection tests, different selection tests, and finally the last point will be about the background investigation, or as referred to checking the background investigation of employees. Now we start with this one as an introduction. Now we're talking about selection, which is the company selecting new employees or candidates to be permanent employees in the organization. However, selection is a very important procedure in human resource management because the considerations of both performance of the employees and also the requirements of handling the job, which can result in either cost or an effective kind of job. So in other words, when we select employees here, we're actually talking about companies' future performance. We said before that companies is actually a cluster of departments, sections, and different units. Each has its own goals and objectives that are linked all the way up to the strategies of the company itself. And accordingly here, the main objective of the company is actually done by the different levels of the organization. Now, when we talk about employees, we're actually talking about the performance of such kind of tasks and duties that can help achieve the company's goals. So that is why when we talk about selection, we do talk about the future of the company in terms of its effectiveness as for performance. So that is why we have to select the right employees who can manage to handle all the tasks and duties needed to achieve the objectives. Besides, selection is actually considered to be cost. Besides, here, when we talk about the new employees, we're talking about the methods used to select the right employees. So if the company goes wrong in selecting the employees, then it's just wasting time and money. Further, employees are considered to be fixed costs in the company. So if not being utilized, then this is just throwing money outside without any value. Another issue that should be considered when selecting is justice and fairness. So through the standards set by the company, the selection process should be fair enough to choose people who are worth the job. Without which, of course, this ethical issue will pop up to the surface, and that the company might be subject to different legal problems according to the severity of such kind of issue. So that's why selection is an important issue and a procedure within the human resource management and should be taken seriously by the specialists in those kind of sections. So here, why careful selection is important. Now here, the importance of selecting the right employees is actually as follows. We said the organizational performance is the number one priority here. So the right employees being selected means good performance within the organization. And of course, the cost of recruiting and hiring. There's a finding that was a research about this issue. The finding was actually about this. The acquisition cost is actually way more than the retention cost. So acquisition here is the process of recruiting and selecting. So if not selecting properly, so this kind of high cost would be of no value. So that is why the companies must pay attention to the selection tools, the validity and reliability of such kind of tools, so that to make sure that only qualified employees who can help the companies or company, a given company, to achieve a strategy is selected. Another issue, the legal obligations and liability by companies. Now this issue is seen in companies where or companies that operates maybe in different geographic territories, for example. In a country where the country itself somehow define given percentage of employees to be hired from different governors, for example, like what happens in some countries like Arab countries. So this is one of the requirements of selecting in such kind of environment or in such different countries. So that is why we have to put into consideration performance, the cost, and any potentially important legal or ethical issues that can be a result of a poor selection method. Now, another issue when we talk about selection is that we need to avoid negligent hiring claims. Now, when we talk about claims here, these are the consequences of an appropriate selection method. So, carefully examine information on employment application is a good way to avoid this problem. Besides, get written authorization for reference checks and check references is needed. Now, this should be put ahead so that every single employee or candidate is quite aware of such information. Save all records and information about the applicant. Also, it's important to reject applicants for false statement or conviction records for offenses related to the job, especially previous jobs where we have such kind of violent history of candidates or potential candidates. So this can be eliminated to balance the applicant's privacy right with others' need to know. Now when we talk about the need to know kind of information, it's only the kind of information we in a company would like to know in order to take the right or to do the kind of procedures needed and take the right decisions as for selection. However, we should also avoid irrelevant information that can be violating the right of the individuals and can be considered as privacy rights. Finally, take immediate disciplinary action if problems arise. Now these are issues that are of paramount importance. Now the basic testing concepts. Now before we talk about the different methods of testing, there's some very important testing concepts as follows. The first one is called reliability. So what do we mean by reliability here? Reliability means that any kind of test that is used by the company should be reliable, meaning that if I use this test, I will come up with consequences with the results. Now doing the test again after some time should have the same consequences or the same results. So we say the test is reliable. If you have different answers in different time slots, that means the test is not actually reliable. So here, consistency of scores obtained by the same person, okay, when retested with identical or equivalent tests. So I'm using the same test with the same person, but in different time sets. If we have different results, then that means this kind of test is not actually accurate in terms of reliability. So Are test results stable over time, or do they change? So if they change, this test is not actually kind of reliable test. Another issue is called validity, which is another important concept. Now, what do we mean by validity here? Remember, selection is trying to get the right person doing the kind of jobs we have already defined in our job analysis. Now, we need to use a tool in order to select among the candidates. This tool is the test. Now, this test should only be examining the kind of activities inside these jobs. In other words, validity means to what extent I am testing what should be done in the workplace. So that is what we mean by validity. So this indicates whether a test is measuring what it is supposed to be measuring. Besides, does the test actually measure what it is intended to measure? So if you're talking about an accounting position, so any kind of tests being designed for such kind of jobs should only be encapsulating the tasks and duties within such kind of interest, that is accounting. So we say the test is valid. Now these are very important concepts before we start utilizing the test by the company. Now, how to validate a test? Validating a test is a set of 5 steps as follows. Of course, we need standards. So that is why the first step is you analyze the job. Because without the analysis of the job, without the job specification and the job description, you cannot actually test employees. Remember, when we talk about validity, we said it is you testing what is supposed to be tested. So we need to know the standards, okay, through which we can somehow match the candidate's behavior during the test with the already set standards. So if they match, so we say, now this employee or this candidate is actually worth giving the job. So we refer to them as predictors and criteria. We call them predictors because we can use them to predict the behavior of the candidates in the future. Step number 2, to choose the test. Here it can be like a test battery or single test. Some companies might use different types of tests. In some kind of organizations, the different levels within such kind of organizations might also require different kind of tests. For example, in top management, where you need people with high analytical kind of experiences, so maybe knowledge test can be good enough to check upon the kind of expertise. But in different levels, you might need physical test, knowledge test, maybe things about the personality as well. So these are all issues we can use in a test battery. Besides, number 3, now once we are sure with the type of test we have, we need to conduct the test. So that's why we say concurrent or predictive validation, as we start with the test itself, and then relate your test scores and criteria, scores versus the actual performance. So this is one way to match the actual performance of the candidate with the scores he gets, and the matching with the standards we have already set in order to decide whether he or she can be accepted or not. Finally, we cross-validate and also revalidate, which is we do step number 3 and 4 again. Doing test number 3 and 4 can somehow come up with a quite accurate results as talking about different tests. Of course, these procedures are done by many companies, but we should not forget that the importance of the job itself might require quite attention using the right test, different tests, validating and revalidating again, okay? But when we talk about some kind of other tests, like low-level kind of jobs, maybe one test is more than enough to come up with the right decision. Now, testing program guidelines, we said that among the things we have to consider is the tips on how to do the right selection using the right test. For example, as you see here, use tests as supplements, which means that test is only one way that can help choose the candidates among the others. So do not make tests your only selection tools. So use them to supplement other tools like interviews and background checks. So besides the interview that you handle in a job, okay, in order to get candidates being accepted, maybe tests can also help, maybe background checks. So this actually varies from one company to another. Another tip here, validate the tests, which is very important. It is best to validate them in your own organization, okay, as you saw it. However, the fact that the same tests have proven valid in similar organizations, called validity organization, is usually adequate. So that is why when we talk about the industry level, we're talking about similar organizations that usually conduct somehow similar tasks, like universities, as an example. Number 3, revalidate periodically. Employers need an applicant's attitude change over time. So you want to make sure that the consequences of the test is somehow reliable enough and last longing. So that is why we need to revalidate periodically in different times. Besides monitor your testing selection program, for example, you might need to ask questions such as what proportions of minority and non-minority applicants are rejected, and at each stage of the hiring process here in the company, in the process, can this really affect the selection or the test that you're handling? Now, this is a very important issue, especially if you're talking about a company that operates in multicultural or homogeneous kind of heterogeneous kind of countries like Malaysia, for example, or USA. So the possibility of having candidates from different places, different cultures, different races is quite high. So that is why this question is very important. Besides, keep accurate records. Record why you rejected each applicant. This can help in the future. And finally, manage test conditions. So here, you need to administer tests in areas that are reasonably private, quiet, and well lit. Because without these kind of features, the distraction will be quite clear. So candidates' final result might be really affected by such kind of issues like the timing of the interview, of the test example, the environment where the test was handled, the light, the environment. Sometimes even the one who is involved in the test can also affect or distract the candidates. So these are important guidelines we have to take into consideration. Now, what could be the types of tests? There are different types of tests as follows. Tests about cognitive or mental abilities can of course be different from the task of motor and physical abilities. Okay? Which means that here, according to the nature of business, companies might choose the right tools. So cognitive here is more about the intellectuality of the candidates, the kind of knowledge he or she might have, and of course the way they can handle and process information, especially in top management positions. While other kind of jobs might require motor and physical abilities. Okay, for example, talking about the operational department, here the kind of task will not be cognitive, will be more than more than that. Okay, here we're talking about machineries. We're talking about muscles, for example, holding things, fixing things, for example. So that is why the test will be totally different. And the third one is about personality and interest, which is another type of test. Finally, we have tests that measures the achievement. So this is a very common type of test. Sometimes companies might only focus on the way things are actually done. So that's why we refer to it as achievement. Now, this is an example of a different test here. Question applicant in a test of mechanical comprehension. For example, which gear will turn the same way as the driver? This is the driver. Now you have two different gear. So the candidate will be given this question to check upon his or her understanding of the mechanism of such kind of system, which is an example of motor and physical kind of test. Now when we talk about personality test items, we have actually different types of personalities. But again, before we talk about personality here, remember that the type of job might require specific kind of personal traits. And that is why we need to conduct such kind of tests, without which this kind of test is not actually important. So again, the nature of the job itself might help in selecting the right test. So we have different types here. Examples, look at this question. It doesn't make sense to work hard on something if no one will notice. Now, there will be different answer. Definitely true, somewhat true, neither true nor false, somehow or somewhat false, or definitely false. Now, people will be different, of course, answering these issues. So some might put A, okay, others can put E, B, C. So that is why we need to check the different personality traits in regards to this issue. Another example, I tend to let the others do most of the talking in conversations. Other question, I have remained calm in situations where others have become upset. So by having candidates answering the questions here, the employer or the recruiter can actually have some kind of predictors. They can now predict how those people can somehow behave in the future in such similar situation. Now, talking about personality, we may talk about the big five, which refers to the different kind of personalities. For example, extroversion. Now, the kind of person who like to have different kind of connection with the others, okay, up and up with the others, can share ideas, do not talk into themselves. Other kind of personality here, emotional stability, neuroticism. This is a very important issue when we talk about jobs that requires dealing with customers. So the kind of jobs that require such kind of traits is very important. So that is why we have personality tests. Openness to experience. Now, imagine that we're talking about a manager or a top management position. Now, this feature is of great importance. Now, this kind of personality traits can really affect the others, and accordingly, decisions and performance of the others. Other personality trait here is agreeableness, okay, kindness, like a person who likes to open up to the others, being friendly with the others, and finally, conscientiousness, which is the emotional intelligence somebody might have and develop by time because of personality, thinking about the others, being conscious about issues. So such kind of traits will all affect our performance. And actually performance is actually one of the determinant of personal behavior. and that is why companies are using them a lot in some kind of test. But again, we said that the personality test is actually based on the job itself. Now, work samples and simulation as another example of tests. So measuring work performance directly. Here, this is one of the ways that can be used, especially in manufacturing industries. Work samples, management assessment centers can also help here, and also miniature job training and evaluation. So by this, we create a mini environment in which we can somehow test the new candidate's performance. So when we talk about work samples at universities, for example, we talk about a candidate who delivers a lecture to the students. And according to his or her offer, so the recruiter can tell whether there are some kind of, let us say, dexterity skills needed to be somehow polished, whether the capabilities somehow match the required standards or not. Then the last one here is talking about the background investigations and reference checks. Now, when we talk about the investigations and checks, this is a very common topic in the United States of America. So here, job applicants can expect reference checks, background employment checks, while in other countries like Yemen, for example, or in some Arab countries, this is still not utilized that much. Maybe culture somehow affects the way companies look at this issue. Besides, companies in, the companies that operate in a country where there's high collectivism usually face issues handling this point. So background employment checks. Okay, we're talking here about the past record of the employee. Also, when we talk about background, we talk about any potential criminal record checks. So this is actually done in different places, even here in Yemen. Driving record checks. Okay, this is according to the need of the job itself. And finally, credit checks. Now, we don't need this in Yemen that much, but this is quite needed in different places like Europe or in America. So these kind of checks can vary from one place to another, but they are all means of gathering information about the past performance of those candidates, which can also be very useful. Now, why do we conduct investigations and checks? The reason here, of course, is to verify factual information provided by the applicants. Because so far, what we get is actually information from the candidates. Now, we need to check and verify whether such kind of information is actually right or not. Besides, we need them to uncover damaging information. Some of the information offered by candidates might be false. So one way to uncover such kind of information, to check upon the truthness of such kind of information, is actually through the background. Now here, sources of information, as we talk about background investigation, we have former employers. This is a very common source of information. Sometimes in interview, they may address a question about past experiences regarding different jobs the candidates have already worked in. But when we want to check on the information from different sources, former employers can be a good source here, especially if we're talking about honesty, talking about performance, punctuality, personality, etc. So valid information here, vivid information, and worthwhile information can all be taken from these sources. Current supervisor that the candidate has. Now, supervisors are always at direct contact with the employees, and accordingly they can be very good source of information. Written references by others, especially those who've been or who've dealt with the candidates. Social networking sites. Now, this is a modern type of background checks, but it is used widely, especially in international businesses. Now, by going through the social network sites where the candidates is quite active, they can gather some kind of information, or they can at the very least predict the behavior of such kind of employee. As for trends regarding his or her preferences, for example, beliefs, opinions, shared values, etc. So this information can be really gathered from such kind of sources. Now, as we check information from different sources, we need to make sure that this kind of information will help us develop the right decision. So, for example, include on the application form a statement that is written for applicants to sign explicitly authorizing a background check. Now, this is especially in Arab countries. You have somehow to inform the candidates that we will check information from different sources, including former, for example, employers. So use telephone references if possible. Be persistent in obtaining information, because the more information we gather, the better our decisions will be. Use references provided by the candidate as a source of other references. But of course, we should not only rely on references. We can use different types of sources as for background. And finally, ask open-ended questions to elicit more information from references. So here, if there is a person who I might refer to talking about this candidate, I can somehow establish different questions as for past performance, his punctuality, for example, the attitudes in the workplace, so the personality traits he or she exhibited in the workplace, etc. Now, such kind of information can help us develop our own decisions as for whether to select or not. Now, reasons for pre-employment medical examination, which is somehow one of the requirements. Here, to verify that the applicant meets the physical requirement of the position. But of course, this might be one of the conditions of a given job. Remember, designing the test is actually based on the nature of the job itself. So when we talk about medical examinations, sometimes this is a very important issue. If you're talking about, say, engineers who are supposed to work in different environmental places. So that is why we need to check upon such kind of information, because such kind of status might affect the performance. To discover any medical limitations to be taken into account. Of course, to establish a record and baseline of the applicant's health for future insurance or compensation claims. Reduce absenteeism and accidents. Now, we know about his medical status, so we can adjust the environment where he works. To detect communicable diseases here, diseases that can somehow be contagious in the workplace should of course be rejected. The last point in our session will be about the systems used here. We have the automated applicant tracking and screening system. Now, this is actually important because as we use a system in which information can help to select the right person, we can simply knock out applicants who do not meet job requirements. It's about a system that automatically eliminate those kind of applicants, allow employers to extensively test and screen applicants online. And finally, we can match hidden talents of applicants to available openings. Now, without such kind of systems, this might take long time and requires a lot of efforts by the human resource manager. So what do we look for in an application tracking system? It must be easy to build. Now we have like a deposit of information we can use to select employees. So such kind of system must be quite easy so that the employers can use, capable of being integrated into the company's existing human resource information system platform, and of course should be able to provide employees selection performance metrics, reports including time to fill, cost to hire, and applicant source statistics. So all this kind of information can make it quite easier for the process of selecting employees by the human resource manager. So by this, dear students, we come to the end of our session. Through the session, we discussed the following point. We discussed what is meant by reliability and validity. We also talked about how to validate a test using different ways. We cited important testing guidelines, and we listed several tests used for employee selection. And also we talked about the background investigations and the importance of such kind of process, how to conduct it. By this, we reach our end point in this session. You will have an attachment number 5 for this session where you have to follow the instructions for answering such questions. And by this, dear students, we end our session. Thank you very much for listening attentively. I wish you all the best, inshallah, and see you in our next session. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.